As you all know, for everyone who's here, the purpose behind this Dr. Jasper session is to understand how to install Jaspersoft Server using our WAR file distribution. So there's a couple of different reasons why you might choose that over our other installers, and we'll briefly discuss some of that information as well, as far as why, and then of course the how on how you're going to do this. And as you guys have probably noticed, for those of you who have joined other Dr. Jasper sessions, those have been done previously, mostly by Michael Belkowicz. I will be kind of pseudo taking over the Dr. Jasper stuff for now. So my name is Jake Brown, and I'll be doing the installation of the WAR file with you. Okay. So as far as the agenda for this Dr. Jasper session, so we're going to go over what is the WAR file distribution exactly, what does that consist of, when or why would you use this WAR file distribution for your install over, let's say, like if you're on a Windows installer, why don't I just take the Windows installer component, right? So why and when you would use that. An overview of the prerequisite installation requirements that you're going to need to have for this installation to be successful. We'll do a demo. Now, as part of that demo, we're going to go through and have a look at the pretty much the single config file that you need to fill out for this installation to work. So as part of the demo, we'll go through configuring the necessary file for that installation to be successful. Then we'll go ahead and jump into a Q&A session. And finally, there's just a resources page that we have here as well that we'll use to give some references out to some of the information that we've looked up. All right, so what exactly is the WAR file distribution? So a WAR file, otherwise known as a web application resource or sometimes a web application archive. It's essentially a zip file, in a sense, used to compile a web application. So it contains all of the resources that you need to build this web application and to get it going and to get it installed correctly. In this case, it's going to be the Jasper Server web application. And this WAR file is simply going to build it out for us. Now, as you can see from the images below, Jaspersoft supports several different database types and web application server types. So just some of the most common ones are Oracle, Postgres, obviously, which is the default. If you use another installer from us, and then Microsoft SQL Server are probably the most common ones that we have used. Apache Tomcat is the most common web server. Every once in a while, you'll run into a JBoss implementation or Wildfly. But in today's example, since I'm going to be installing on my local host, I have access to a Postgres SQL database and an Apache Tomcat web server. Real quick here, I see that there have been some questions. Okay. Very good. So we'll move on to the next one here. So next slide here, what is the WAR file distribution? It's just a continuation from the previous slide. So when you download the WAR distribution, and we'll have a look at this here in just a moment as far as what this content is and where it is. But it's pretty much broken up into 6 major sections as far as the resources available to you. The first one here is the Build-O-Matic content. So this is going to be where all of our JS scripts are located. As you can see, we work with both .bat files and .sh files, so you can install it from either a Linux-based or a Windows-based operating system. We have the database scripts. So there's going to be a SQL folder that contains the actual scripts depending on which database type you're installing to. We also include some server about Jasper reports in general. So this is going to have like an install guide as well as many other documents to use even after your install is up and running. We do have some extra samples. Oops. Let me go back. We do have some extra samples that we provide as well, such as reports, data sources, and other sample files like translation files, ad hoc security files, etc. We do have some standard sample data that we throw out there as well to highlight some of the features. And then last but not least, we have the WAR file archive, which contains all of the dependent jars, web pages, and the other resources that we took a look at in the previous slide discussing what exactly a WAR file is. So then what it has been answered as far as what is the WAR installer. The next thing is when or why should you use the WAR installer? So one easy thing to dictate whether or not the WAR installer is going to be your choice for the installation package is what operating system are you installing on? In many cases, in my time in professional services where I've traveled out to clients and done this on site, we're in a situation where they're using a Linux-based server, so Red Hat or something equivalent to that. And in that case, they've installed an instance that doesn't have a GUI. So using the other installers that TIBCO provides to install Jaspersoft isn't really helpful because I have nothing really to interface with the installer. So since this WAR file distribution is just a consistent of Ant scripts and then the resources that we need to install Jaspersoft Server, we don't need anything more than a GUI to do it. So that's one reason when or why you should use it. Another reason would be if you'd like to install Jaspersoft Server on a application server, excuse me, on a server that uses a web application other than Tomcat or a database other than Postgres. So any of you here in the session know if you've used our bundled installers is generally what we refer to them as. So if you use those bundles installers and let's say you go and grab the Mac OS one or the Windows one, it gives you a GUI to walk through, but a lot of the times it's going to pigeonhole you to either using a existing or new Postgres database or an existing or new Apache Tomcat server. So not every scenario you go into do you want to use that combination. And if that's the case, this WAR file distribution allows you to manually define properties like that to get your install a bit more custom fit to your environment. So an overview of some of the prerequisites that are required before this installation completes. So the first thing is we obviously have to go and download the WAR file distribution. Now, once I'm done with this slide, I'll go ahead and exit out of it, and we'll do a quick demonstration in a web browser where you can get this. I know sometimes the e-delivery website can be a little bit difficult to find what product specifically you're looking for. So we'll have a quick look at that just so when the session's over, you guys can go have a look there. The file itself is, and I'm going to be doing all this just as a side note in Jaspersoft Server version 7.5.0. Please keep in mind that this process really doesn't change from server version to server version, considering my use case is I'm just installing a brand new server. So nothing's really going to change stepwise if you take this offline after the session and do it with a different version. It's going to be named something similar to this, though. The other thing that we need to do is you need to make sure that you have a JDK installed and that you have your Java home variable set. So setting the Java home variable is quite easy. Any server level admin should be able to do that for you fairly quickly. We won't really go over setting that. I have it pre-configured only because setting your Java home variable differs so much from operating system to operating system that it may work a little bit differently for each and every one of us on the call here. The other things that you need to have previously installed is your application server. So in this case for me, it's going to be Tomcat, which I already have multiple versions of Tomcat installed on my server. So I'll just pick one and install it to there. You need to have your proper database server installed So this is going to be wherever you're installing the Jaspersoft repository database. So in my case, again, it's a local environment. I have a licensed Postgres that I can use and install to, no problem. So I'm going to do a Postgres install, but you can use any of our supported repository database servers. And then last and not least, before you actually hit install and start running things, is you need to properly configure a default master.properties file. So that's a little open-ended right now as far as what exactly is a default.masters property file, but we will go over that here shortly once we get the WAR installer download and we start taking a look at its contents. Okay, so that is going to bring us into our demo next. So we're going to have a look at a couple of things here. I'm going to go ahead and end our slideshow for now. And I am going to go out to Chrome. And the first place I'm going to show you guys is our e-delivery website. Okay, so we should get a landing page like this or similar to this. Keep in mind I'm an internal employee, so it may look a little bit different in some of this. But usually what I do to go and get this is we have an analytics section here on the home page. I'll go to analytics, and then it's generally about page 3 or page 4, and you can see TIBCO Jaspersoft Server Professional Edition. So your edition may differ. I'm just going to go ahead and work with the Professional Edition. It's usually just a license feature regardless. You can see the available versions that it has. We just simply need to click download here. I'm going to go ahead and pick my operating system, even though this is going to be fairly irrelevant since the WAR installer is available to all operating systems selected here. I'm going to keep my 7.5 selection, tell it I've agreed to the license agreement, and then I'm going to go into the individual file downloads rather than getting the full product download. Under the Jaspersoft Server software, you are going to find this file. So you see the bin.zip. So the bin.zip is always interchangeable with the WAR file distribution. That's generally what they call it, but this is where you can find it. It's about 718 megabytes. So depending on your internet connection, it may take a little bit to download, but that is where you can find it. All right. So now we're going to be hopping into the demo portion. So what I've done ahead of time is I've unzipped the bin installer here. So we already have one ready to go and ready to work with. And as you can see, we've got our Apache Ant section, which contains our Ant scripts. We've got a Build-O-Matic section, which is mostly where we're going to be working with. And this is where we're going to run the installation from, is from the Build-O-Matic folder here eventually. The docs folder, which contains the documentation that we discussed earlier in the slide. This is where all those docs are located. These are just licenses, and on top of that, these are eval licenses. So you guys will certainly want to replace with whatever license you've been given from Jaspersoft or from TIBCO. Here's the actual WAR file itself, as well as another license. In this case, this is my internal perpetual license, so I can keep using it. And then more samples. So I'm not going to dig real deep into the samples. Perhaps that can be a session for another day as far as working with some of these samples. And actually the last Dr. Jasper we did, we covered an external auth sample and went through the configuration on that. But this is the WAR installation distribution here. So the next steps are, because this can be a little daunting as far as, okay, I've just downloaded a zip file, I've extracted it, now I have all these other files, what exactly do I do with it? So we're gonna go into the Build-O-Matic. And the way that this works is there is, so normally this default.masters.property file is not there. I have manually put that there ahead of time. So let me just move it out of here real quick so you guys can get a picture of what that's really going to look like. It's really just going to be this one file, and everything else is going to be as if you just downloaded it. So the next thing to do is we need to go ahead and grab a file from the sample conf folder here. So you can see that we provide a list of 5 sample configuration files for this installation. These are probably the 5 most common repository databases that we install. I would have to double check the platform support documentation, but these may be the 5 that we officially certify as well. Trying to install on something outside of our platform support is going to be kind of at your own risk and at your best effort to get it to work. So what you need to decide now is, what database server am I going to be using? In this case, I know that I'm going to be installing using a Postgres database. So what I simply have to do is I have to copy this file and paste it just one directory back into this Build-O-Matic folder. And you can see here's the file. Now, the only thing that you have to do differently to this file, besides filling it out with your proper config values as far as your installation details, is you need to rename it. So this Build-O-Matic script is expecting a file for configuration called default_master.properties. So all we've simply done there is we've renamed whatever DB type it was to default, and then just move the file back a directory. Now I'm simply just going to replace mine since it's already pre-configured and I know it will work. But we will open up this file and go through it next. Okay, so some of these sections, as you can probably tell if you've looked at this file before and then just scrolling through it, most of this file is just comments and information telling you what it is doing. The majority of these installs, you're probably not going to have to configure much more than, I would say, the quote unquote default values that we kind of expect you to fill out. But we'll go over these just in case any of them are relevant to you. So this is basically, this first section here is just telling you, outside of the licensing and copyright information, it's just telling you how this default master's property file works. Hey, you place it here and name it this. You can get it for each database type from this location. So we've already done that, so we'll move on. The next thing it wants are values for what is our application server type, what is the path to our server home directory, and then where is the location of our database and what are the settings that we can use to connect to this. So as you can see, first it's asking about our application server settings. By default, these are in there as Tomcat. So you can see in the comments here, it gives you ideas about which levels, or which versions rather, are supported. So with Tomcat for 7.5, we support 8.5 and 9. And I have an 8.5 installation, so we're good to go there and we can move on to the next step. If you're interested in any other application server type, they're all available here, as well as their versionings. This can also be found in the platform support. So I'm going to leave Tomcat and leave the others commented out. The next here, next setting is I just need to tell it where it can find my Tomcat at. So in this particular case, this was previously modified to include just a home user location. In my particular case, I've given it the path of where my Tomcat 8543 lives. If I were on something other than Unix or Linux, I could certainly comment this out and use the Windows version for that. So you can see that the syntax works a little bit different if you're using a Windows install. And then also, if you're using an operating system that has a managed Tomcat instance, you can set it this way. So both of these would then be commented out, and you'd be using this Catalina home and this Catalina base property. Again, this is, certain Linux installs that manage the app server through the OS as well. Same thing for JBoss and Glassfish. We won't dig into those, but if you're installing on that app server type, it's basically the same kind of information that it's looking for. The next thing it's looking for is the database type. Again, since we downloaded the, or moved the Postgres_master and just renamed it, this is going to be pre-configured with a Postgres config. So your SQL Server versus your Oracle config here might look a little bit different. In the grand scheme of things, they're basically wanting all the same properties. They just want to know where your database is, what user they should use when they go through and create these things. And in Oracle's case, they might ask you for both a system username and password and then a Jasper username and password to create the user once the install gets going. So Postgres is my DB type. In this particular case, my Postgres is just on my local host here, so I can just simply put localhost or a loopback address. And then my username and password are both just Postgres here. I probably don't have to uncomment this, but I've been playing with this file some, looking at Postgres that I've got running on different ports. 5432 is the default port. If your database configuration is using the default port for your database, there's really no need to uncomment that. However, you can if you've specified that traffic to operate through a different port. Now, one thing I just want to mention as a caveat, I would say outside of simple mistakes in the configuration file, as far as just not knowing where certain things are or having an incorrect password, one of the biggest things that slows down and puts a halt to these installations is people not verifying if you're not working with a local host, if you're working with a remote host. A lot of the times you have to go to a separate team unless you manage this as well and have the security opened up, right? So the location that you're installing the Jasper server on and the port that it's attempting to get traffic from needs to be open. Otherwise, you could run into some installation errors. And what happens a lot of the times is the installation just hangs because it continually tries to connect to the server and is unable to because of the security. So just a heads up if any of you go on to attempt this and run into that. Now, by default, these two properties, the js.db name and the web app name pro, are both commented out because by default, it's just Jasper Server and Jasper Server-Pro. Now, the js.db name, so this is what's going to get created for a database in Postgres or whatever server you've defined to install. So just because I've got some others on there and I don't want them to overwrite it, I'm just going to give it an alias of Dr. Jasper. So when my DB gets created, I will look for this DB specifically after the fact. And I'm going to do the same thing for this is going to be the name of my web app. And since I'm using the pro version and not the community edition of Jasper Server, I uncomment the web app name pro. And I'm going to give it the same Dr. Jasper since I've got multiple Jasper server applications running over in my Tomcat. We're going to quickly go through the additional settings in this. Again, a lot of these you may not need, and some of these we're just going to quickly go through since they may not be super relevant for the example we're doing here today. So we do have a standard set of drivers for the supported repository database types. If you would like to use an alternative driver than what we are providing, this is where it can be done. So this configuration just simply needs to be filled out, and the jar file needs to be provided at the location that's provided here. There's also a way, and this would be more for kind of a piece-by-piece install. Let's say you only really needed to build the web app and you didn't actually want it to create the repository database. Maybe it's already created and you're just rebuilding the web app for whatever reason. You can do this to skip the JDBC driver deployment. So sometimes you just want to skip that. That's how you're able to do that. This next section is really only relevant if you already have JMX ports being used on the current server, or if you have multiple instances of Jaspersoft Server running on the same instance. So this is essentially just JMX monitoring data, configuring that. So simply providing a port if you need to change that, the actual JMX name, especially if you've got more than one instance of Jasper Report Server on the same server, and then where your host is. AWS, we're going to go ahead and skip that. The AWS install works a bit differently. If you are looking to use an AWS environment, we actually have AMIs available through AWS that will help you set up these installs. So you really don't even need to go through this if you want to go that route. So we're just going to skip over that section. Glassfish we'll go ahead and skip as well. If anyone here would like to install with an app server of Glassfish, this is where you can configure some more of that information that it's needed, but we're just going to use Tomcat for now. So this report scheduler email properties, these can also be configured after the fact in the web app in this webinf js.courts.properties file. So these are the values that are going to get put there by default. Again, you can go into the file after the fact and change these, but if you would like to set them during the install, so you've got one less step to do as far as modifying this, you can certainly uncomment it and fill this out, and it will install using that information and pre-configure that information. Encryption settings. So this is really just for hiding your Build-O-Matic passwords and encrypting some of these passwords and some of these files. So as it says here, for the Build-O-Matic, you really only need to turn encryption equals true on. For these other things here in the context XML that define like your JNDI connections and your other kind of sensitive information, you're going to have to fill the rest of this out and define the encryption type that you'd like to use, but that's essentially what this is for encrypting the config files that get created. This next thing here is really only for customers who are on, I would say, languages that aren't UTF-8 supported by default. So Jasper Report Server needs UTF-8 encoding for this repository data to work. So in some instances, you may have a server that's default locale is something other than UTF-8. This is so that you can give Postgres a UTF-8 encoding, because by default, Postgres takes the system environment locale and installs with that. So very rare case where you need to override it. You know, let's say you're working with Hebrew characters or maybe Japanese or Korean characters or something like that. They may not be UTF-8 encoded. All right, and then last but not least, this is for external authentication data sources. So this is more of an SSO thing. Configuration for LDAP. So we're going to go ahead and skip that since that's really outside of the scope of the session today. And then last, and this is really just a dummy property that's fixing a bug, as you can see from the comments here. But this property has to go last. So you can just leave it. I just leave the bottom of the file as is. So that's the overview of the configuration file. So I'm going to save that. Once you have that configuration file filled out, you're ready to start the install, assuming that you've done all the prerequisite steps. So I'm going to check a few of those prerequisite steps. So I know that I've already got Tomcat running, or excuse me, not running. I actually need Tomcat to be stopped during this installation process. So I'm just going to go out to where my Tomcat normally is if it's started, and I can see that it's off. I need to check and make sure that my Postgres is running, which it should be, but I am using pgadmin. So I am just going to check real quick that I can get it into my local instance here. I can, great. So Postgres is running and Tomcat is stopped. And the last thing that I'm gonna do is I'm just going to check and make sure that my Java home is configured correctly. And it is. So it's pointing out to JDK 1.8, which is officially supported in 7.5. All right, so what I'm going to do next is, I'm already there, but simply what you can do, and I'll do it just to show you, but this is from my file explorer, or maybe you only have the command line, but I'm simply going to go out here and open up a new term 2 tab inside of Build-O-Matic, and if I do a pwd, you can see that we're inside of the Build-O-Matic folder now. Okay, so now we're ready to do the actual install and let the scripts run. So the command that we're going to want to use is jsinstall.sh, since I'm on a Unix-based environment. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to give it the test command. So what this test command is going to do is it's essentially going to attempt to do all of your prerequisites as if it was going to do a dry run at installing this, except it's not actually going to install anything. So if you did have a problem, like if it couldn't find your Tomcat, or if it couldn't connect to your database, or it couldn't find your, not your database in this case, it hasn't been created yet, but your database connection, this would give you some sort of fail message. As you can see, I've gotten a build successful message since I've gone ahead and pre-configured these things and gotten it set up. So the next thing I'm going to do is jsinstall.sh, and I'm just going to show you this command. I'm not going to run it. If you're on a production environment and you don't care about getting any of the Jaspersoft sample data, such as the food mart data and our sample reports, there is a minimal command that you can run. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to create your web app without our imported samples that I just mentioned, and it's also going to skip creating the food mart and the sugar CRM databases. So just to give you an idea of what the full install looks like, we're just going to run the full install itself, and I'll probably just have it skip the databases that are already created. But let's go ahead and run the installer. This is simply all we need to do once we configure it, is run this jsinstall.sh or .bat. And generally, this install script, especially if you're skipping the samples, usually takes about 2 to 3 minutes. It usually just takes a few more minutes on top of that if you are importing and creating the samples. But as you can see here, it's going through, and it's kind of hard to read and hard to tell, but it's importing my repository database with resources that are needed. And eventually here, it'll start building our web application from the WAR file itself. Okay, so now it's getting to the sample database creation. So you can see it says that this food mart database already exists. Would you like to recreate it? I'm just going to hit enter. The default option is no, it already exists. Same with sugar CRM. You can see now it's deploying the web application out to my Tomcat server with the web app name that I gave it of Jasperserver-Pro Dr. Jasper. And now we get a build successful message. So you can see that the total install time as far as the scripts running was 1 minute and 41 seconds. So the majority of your installs are going to be getting the prerequisites met and configuring the Build-O-Matic file as opposed to the actual installer itself. So let's just go check it. We think that it's installed. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now, if I find the right Tomcat here, is I'm just going to start Tomcat up. And we're just going to go verify everything. So I'm going to do a quick refresh on my local databases. And you can see my repository database has been installed, Dr. Jasper. And it looks like it has been populated with data, but just real quick, I'll go ahead and run a query. This is just our users table. Oops, not plural. Okay, so it's been populated with data. Fantastic. And now, to give it the correct web app name. And let's see here. Okay, I think I am actually running on a different port, which is why I was looking at this server file. So let me find that real quick. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. The reason it's going to be doing that is because Tomcat only supports one instance of the Jaspersoft web app in it at a time, and I currently have 2 in there. So I'm just going to tell Tomcat to shut down. So it looks like an environment thing may prevent me from showing you the web app coming up and booting. I can assure you that the install was complete, but I know that we're kind of running low here on time for the session and that we would still like to do a Q&A portion. So I'm going to go ahead and have a look at that here real quick. All right, so I only see one thing in the comment here. And I might need a little bit more explanation on the question. Please comment on the latest version of Jasper Library, which we use with our California State clients in the Sacramento area. I'm not quite sure what you want me to comment on or what information you're looking for there. I'd be happy to direct you in the right area, but I'm not quite sure what exactly it is you're looking for there for an answer. Sorry. Let me see here in the Q&A. Does it have all the features of the full product? So generally the way Jaspersoft Server works is it's usually dictated by license. So usually what happens is it's usually the same version of the server, it's the same code behind, but generally what happens is depending on what type of license you have and what license file is deployed, it kind of gives you access or denies access to certain features. So with the community edition, you're going to be missing some things like being able to run HTML5 charts and Google Maps, some more advanced quote unquote visualizations, I would say, is kind of the difference there. All right, so let's see. Next question here from Nick. Do I need extra license for Java for using WAR installation in prod environment if we have a commercial license for Jasper Server? No, you do not. So Java, and by Java, I'm thinking you're referring to the JDK. So that's a free download per our platform support article. We do have different versions of the JDK that are supported. So no, as far as I know, unless if there's a particular version of the JDK that we support that requires a license, which I haven't seen, you don't need any extra licenses for Java when you go this WAR route. It's simply just a matter of getting the JDK installed on your system. Edward, as far as where you can find a recording of this webinar session and other Dr. Jasper sessions, we have a Dr. Jasper content section on our website. So before we end the session here, I'm going to show you guys one or two more slides just as far as resources go, as far as where you can find some of these things. So if you're unable to find it, please reach out to us. We do have a email account that we monitor. The reason I don't know off the top of my head is because this is my first week doing Dr. Jasper, and I'm getting up to speed a little bit. So I do know that we make this stuff available. As far as where exactly to go get it, let's take a look at our Dr. Jasper section and see if it's listed there. And if not, we can further coordinate with you to get that. I think there might be one more question here. Does it have all the features of the full product? As far as the community edition, I think is what you're referring to. The answer to that is no, it does not. I mentioned a few of the differences as far as certain visualizations that you try to build or report on. So for example, the community edition does not support our HTML5 charts, which are the high charts API library, right? So those are not supported, as well as some of our more custom components that allow you to build custom SVGs, TIBCO maps, even some more advanced features on the server like auditing and monitoring are not really available on a community edition. So there are some differences, and the differences can probably be, if we go out and compare community versus pro, forgive my typos. So there is some information out there. I gave you some highlights, but our community goes over a little bit of it as well. And if that turns into a more fruitful discussion as far as going over your use cases and, if a full product license makes sense for you, that, that's a conversation that we're happy to have as well. And we have often. Okay. So I don't see any more questions coming across the QA. If that's the case, I'll go ahead and just move on to the last couple of slides here, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So Q&A we're in the middle of. So I just wanted to make this available to you guys as well so you can see. So again, I am part of the customer success team. We do have an orientation website to kind of help you get started with some of this stuff if customer success is right for you. We do have a community answers website. We also, have the ability, if you want to say, hey, I had this in a session from Dr. Jasper, feel free to tag that in there. As always, our Jaspersoft quick guide. And then some of the links that I used for today's presentation include the e-delivery website that we looked at first, a platform support article, which I used to help build some of these slides and insert some of these graphics. And then we do have an installation guide as well. So the WAR file installation is just a part of it. Sometimes it's hard for people to follow. Sometimes people can follow it just fine. That's why we decided to create this Dr. Jasper session for the people who wanted some help with that. But if you need to look into some finer details, maybe something we didn't go over or didn't go over in as much depth as you had hoped, we do have a document for that. All right. And for those of you who are interested or who come monthly, we will be having our next Dr. Jasper session, May 14th, 2020 is how it's currently planned. Easiest way to remember is the second Thursday of every month for me. All right. So that's going to conclude the slideshow. I'm just real quick going to check our Q&A and see if we've got anything else. And if not, I want to thank you all for joining today. And thank you for bearing with me as I'm just kind of getting my feet wet with these Dr. Jasper sessions. So unless if there's any more questions, I'll wait around for another minute or two in case anybody is finishing anything up. But that's going to conclude our Dr. Jasper session for how to install Jaspersoft Report Server using the WAR distribution file. And thanks a lot for joining today, and we'll see you next time.